going to introduce the new framework as the Svelte. This is a scratch a little bit to learn. Before we started, I want to quickly go over some slides and talk a bit about what Svelte is. So technically, Svelte is a compiler. It generates minimal and highly optimized JavaScript code. You might hear it as a framework before because it does a lot of front-end framework work. It allows us to basically have our output reusable UI component that can output into the logic, use style, and so on. So it allows you to create simple pages website, which like a React Vue and Angular. Now let's go to the differ in this way. That works component is like something really like a React. So Svelte is actually pretty easy to understand. In the process, we write our code using the Svelte syntax, and then it runs through a compiler. Then it turns into a pure optimized JavaScript language and can be read by the browser, so it doesn't inject any overhead code or anything. Like the majority of the work is done at the compiler time. The React, on the other hand, have something called virtual DOM and virtual document object mode is interpreted in the running time, though there is basically a virtual representation of the UI that is kept in memory and synced with the actual DOM. Then it look at the difference and updated the actual DOM as needed. So there is a lot of more to going on behind the scene with a React application, and if you want to learn more about this we can suggest you to the next one. Why do we use Svelte instead of other framework? Let's talk about the advantages and some of the reasons why you would want to use and Svelte. So of course you create dynamic front-end work interfaces. That is not really just Svelte. It's any mode frameworks. It does produce highly optimized JavaScript code with no overhead. There's no virtual DOM. As we talked about in the term, things happen faster. But there's no account holders. I could done a little bit research to find out the Svelte is overall about 30 seconds faster than the other framework work. I'm sure that is a lot of variable that is going to, but there is a framework benefit in some area. Svelte also is out-of-box animation and transition that are really easy to use. We will go over these later in this video. It does has a great ecosystems, and while you have a Svelte kit, which is basically like a Next.js for Svelte and allows you to create Svelte site rendering, which probably it would suggest you doing once you learn the basics. Like I said, it was just like Next.js if you know the React. There also a tool which is called Svelte Native for building native mobile app, which I have not yet to try, but it was the biggest reason to feel like easy to use. I primarily a React coder, but can't saying after all the research I did and trying use For sure, Svelte is much more easier to learn, and you can do a lot more with less code. I will say to build a large scale application like I have in React. So I can't really speak to the scale of person use, but you can felt pretty supported, as we can see some stuff was coming to the managing state. Let's see. So what should you go knowing first? Managing the things so far, we should know the pretty much things about the framework, like JavaScript pretty well include all the fundamentals like function loops, asynchronized programming, so promise array method like each map filler and fetch API. You will need to know the work of kinds, backup of API, and then npm of node package, manage for installing package, and set up for boiler platter. So just like in the React view in Angular we created. The user interfaces, using components as building blocks, and the Svelte components are very similar to views. If you have experience with views, at least it was a similar way to structure. So all components has all the extensions, and you have your logic at the top of your JavaScript. You have output, you're in HTML, middle, and the styling bottom in the bottom. So example have doesn't actually style, but you can see within the script tags, you can see the value creates the functions that also have some created called React values, which we talked about in a bit. And in our output, we can have an HTML. You can also see some curly brace syntax for anything where we want to build variable and experience or anything like there's also conditions and each loops, and there we have used within our HTML, and I will go over this a little bit. So now we can get into the way you use Svelte. Let's try to start it with the Svelte kit. It was easiest way you can get a simple page add up, and the function runs into use digital scouting field tools. That's what we'll do couple minutes in the instruction. Later, it will include a dev server and default it use the rollup packages manager, but you can use this build tool like Vils or jump into the example code right now. Back to the Svelte website to talk about the rest. Svelte, as we talked about, it was a modern JavaScript compiler which allows you to write easy understand the JavaScript code, which is then compiled at a highly efficient code that runs in the browser. So you can see there's a little bit introduction here. We'll talk it each through. We can write the unfronted application using the normal JavaScript to follow the specific rule landed by Svelte, it's a good tool for building highly reactive modern user interfaces for the website. And it was a great alternative to JavaScript frameworks and libraries like React and Angular and Vue. And let's start it as we going to talk about the fundamental, how to get started, and we're going to demo a little bit using Svelte. So just quickly tackle about what the Svelte is. And now when we get into this website here, it has all it needs. It's needed to start it at the dock here. As we talked about, it allows you to build the user interfaces with a simple syntax, very similar syntax. It's not a framework. So if we going down here, it will tells you how the bulky of that works in a browser, while Svelte shift that works into a compiler steps that continues like when you build your apps. So when you build your apps, you just get clean vanilla JavaScript. You don't get all the stuff that a framework will gives you. It also doesn't use a virtual DOM. We can see the going through the example here. This is the JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, and the style, the results, yay. And the funnest part, the nested component. And we can see it's easily just combined two documents and put the same results. And voila, the tag. It says which is the white writing code would be surgically updated by the DOM if when the state of the app changes. So I know it's a little vague to just saying here, so it will be make more senses as we demo more. So let's see by going through this tutorial a component. Basically, we just have a JavaScript tag here, and we have a variable, and we can output that variable in curly braces, so it gives us a really easy syntax like this to work, and how it even added styling to our component. And we can style each one. When we set color red, for a Hello World app or whatever, just do with the Hello World Angular, it's gonna be a lot of more code, or just to have our CSS output as well. Let's see the example. This one, it was much simpler as of the CSS also. And we could just simply follow this report courses to see what's generated project using this smaller digital scaffolding tool. Down here we can see it creates the Svelte app. Let's just quickly going through it. We just talk about the components and resource as the image. We can put anything, any image, just put in there. It will be a resource for in the bracelet. And here, as like the HTML, we can add a style tag to the component and add to the P element. Just put it there. Importantly, there's the rules to the component. It will be impractical to put your entire app in a single component. Instead, we import components from other files to then use them as so we can include elements it will be clear and easier to debug, and easier for else to read and understand what your code is. We are presenting two files here. As we can see, this is a graph. It's in the P element. And this is another graph. We can add the script tag to a Svelte that imported the file, and then nested in the app to markup. Ordinarily, the string I instead of the plain text means the character like the square bracket. So we need to HTML to directly into the component. For example, the word you're reading right now is existing in the markdown files that getting included in the file blocks of HTML. In Svelte, we do this with special tags. The very unique tags. Just put the brackets there and put in strings. It will shows up at the source. And we can keep talking about to the building tools. We could, as we going through, we can get familiar with the Svelte kit and invite and plugin Svelte, or the community library we're using to build up the app. There's also there are a lot of plugin offered in the VS Code extension for the developers to use. You can also use the component API. At the heart of the Svelte is a system of reactivity to keep the DOM in sync with your app states. Like, for example, we can see here. We first need to write up event handler. The click count inside the event handler, we can just put +1. And now the only keeps the DOM in the sync with our application variable as shown in the previous session. It can also keep variable in syncs with others using React declaration. It will be looks just as shown. Of course, we can write the variable, the multiple here. Instead, just put it in the brackets, like here, or regularly here. We're not limited to declaring the reactive value. We can also run the arbitrary state reactively. Like, for example, as the Svelte. As we shown, the number could changes. Since we can put the $sign in front of the things like a blocks. Like we shown here. Svelte is reactively triggered by assignments. Methods that a muted array or object will not trigger updated by themselves. In this example, clicked at the number called addNumber function, which appended a number of the array but doesn't trigger the regulation of the sum. It doesn't change. As one way to fix this is to tell the compiler it has changed. Here, you can also write this more concisely using the ES6 syntax. The same rule applies to the array method. So let's see the simple example here. You won't trick actively unless you follow it up with object equals object. Yeah, this is a good example. It doesn't work. So, in a real application, we need to pass the data from a one component down to its children. To do that, we need to declare a property generally shortcut into the prompts. In Svelte, we do that with the export. The export could help us. Normally works with the JavaScript module. We can just roll up and keep the C. Here. We can easily specify the default value of the prompts. If we now added a second component without an answer prompt, it will fall back into the default. Answer here. If you have an object or property, you can spread them into a component instead of a specific one. Info package. Yeah, easily. You need to reference all the prompts that was passing into the component, including ones that wasn't declared with export. And you can also do this by accessing the $$ and prompts directly. It is not generally recommended as it's difficult for Svelte to optimize, but it's useful in real classes. HTML doesn't have a way of expressing logic like conditional and loops. Svelte does. To conditional render some markup, we wrap it into an if block and try. Update the component and click on the button. Since the two conditions, if user logs in and if the user not logs in, are mutually exclusive, we can simplify this component simply by using a else block. Wow, it's pretty clear. A hashtag character always indicated a block opening tag. A character always indicated a block closing tag. And a character as else in the brackets indicated a block continuing tag. Don't worry, you already learned most of syntax. It was just added to the HTML. Here is a multiple condition that can be chained together with else if x is more than 10, then else. Condition is if 5 is greater than x, then else x is between 5 and 10, and other conditions as if. If we need to loop over the list of data, use each blocks. The express the cat in the case can be any array or array-like object. You can loop over generally library with an iteration. We can currently use the index as a second argument. If you prefer, you can also use the distraction, like place the cat ID and name with ID and name. Yeah, we have the ID. Simply use the index and loop the loop. By default, when we modify the value of each blocks, it will add and remove them at the end of the block and updates any value that have changes. It might not be what you want, but it's easier to show why there's explanation of the remove first thing button a few times. Yay, it's here and it's active. The last node then updated the name value in the remaining DOM nodes, but instead we like to remove only the first component and in the DOM node and leave the others unaffected. To do this, we specified a unique identifier. Here is the thing with the key, which tells Svelte how to figure out which DOM node to change when a component updates. And most web applications have to deal with asynchronous data at some point. Svelte makes it easy and await the value of the promise directly to markup. You can see it's the await here and promise. Only the most recent promise is considered. Remaining, you don't need to worry about the race condition. If you know that your promise can't reject, then only omit the catchback block. You can also omit the first block if you don't want to use until the promise is resolved. As we briefly see already, we can listen to any events and elements with an on directive. You can also declare the event handler here. The quote marks are optimal, but they are helpful for syntax highlights in some environments. DOM event handler can also modify that all the behavior for example, the handler with one modifier would only run a single time. This handler here. We have the full list of the modifier. Component can also dispatch events. So they must create an event dispatcher and must call when the component is first instantiation. Notice the app component is listened to the message dispatched by inner component. And that was thanks for the message directive. The directive is a attribute prefix with on here, followed by the event name, and we dispatched in this case with message. Without this attribution, message would still be dispatched, but the application will react to you. You can try remove attribution and press the button again. And unlike DOM events, component events don't bundle. If you want to listen to an event, some deeply nested component, the intermediate component must forward the event. In this case, we have the same up Svelte and the inner Svelte as the previous characters and outer Svelte. But there's now an outer Svelte component that contains inners. We have the inner here. One way we could solve this problem is add a create event dispatch to outer Svelte, listen to the message event, and creating a bundle for it. But there's a lot of code to write, so Svelte gives a simple solution with equal shorten on message. It was like born event directly without a message means forward on message event. Even forwarding work for DOM events too. We want to get notified of clicks on our custom buttons. To do that, we just need to forward the clicks event on the button event in the custom button Svelte. Yeah, this is the custom button Svelte here. I wrapped up some CSS and imported to the app here. It's simple and clear. Yeah, here is the get back to the hello world, which is the easiest hello world ever we can see. Yeah, you see it says vanilla JavaScript here, the results. Okay, let's start. See how it runs some code in the VS Code. But before we started, we have some file to figure out the rollup config. Now the rollup config bundle is similar to the Webpack. It can be used to imported syntax. We can create component based on application. This is the config that there's some options here we can input, which is going to be the main.js and the source folder. The output is going to be the public and it's going to be the bundler.js. We have the source map by default, but you can shut those off if you want to. The bundler.cs is what the file that your component level styling is going to be compiled into. And there's some other stuff as well as some other plugins, roll-up plugins like Live Reloaded, which is used for our live server. So that the config file for rollup, then package.json, we have a bunch of rollup plugins. We have Svelte when we have our build script, dev script, and so on. Now the source folder only have two files. There's main.js and where it brings in the main apps file, which is like app your app component, where we pretty much initialize it into the document.body. We can pass in the prom, and there's an example to show you. We can pass in the prom and look at the app.svelte. We have our name variable which is being passed in, and the reason that has an export is because you're passing from another file. And we have our style, then we have our output, which is very similar to the demo, the repo on the website. So the public folder by default is just an index HTML. It's including the global CSS, which is the file here. So any global style you want would go here, and I'll actually go to show the demos. We have bundle CSS, which your component level styling, it will compile into the bundle.js, and it is going to be basically your whole application. All your files is going to be compiled into this JavaScript. And I'm going to change the titles here to see